Welcome back. 300,000 subscribers, huh? All right, so let's go ahead and do something a little different today. So I've ranked my favorite teams before. I have not done that this season. I usually, when the season's done, I say who I'm cheering for. What I've got on the board here is 1 through 38. And if you're saying, but there's only 32 teams in the league, you're right. But there's also been teams that have moved in the time that I've watched hockey. And so I wanted to do something a little different when I'm talking about my favorite teams. And I wanted to average it out over all these years, from 1981 through until now. Acknowledging that there were games that I watched in the late 70s and before 81, but do I really remember it? Not that well, no. And so here we go. So number one on the board should be a surprise to no one, and that's the Vancouver Canucks. So being in British Columbia, being about an hour outside of Vancouver, obviously as a little kid, I would have seen Canuck stuff everywhere. My collection really in large part was Canucks and Vancouver related. I was also a big Whitecaps fan, Bob Leonarduzzi fan. Cheered for the Montreal Expos when it came to baseball. Far more than the Blue Jays, and of course then the Expos left, and I was kind of left with the Blue Jays. And I mean, I rooted for the Blue Jays when they won their World Series, but I really wanted to see Montreal win one. So Vancouver ends up being my number one team in the NHL, and of course they've stayed there pretty much the whole time. Number two on the board is Boston. Now, I've mentioned this before and I'll mention it again here. I was fans of both teams well before the 2011 Stanley Cup Final. In fact, when it was official, those teams were going to meet each other in the Stanley Cup Final, I danced around my apartment. I was cheering. A team I cheer for is going to win the Stanley Cup. A team I cheer for is going to win the Stanley Cup. I was absolutely terrible to be around if you weren't a fan of Vancouver or Boston, because gloaty, that's the only time in my hockey career watching hockey, and before the channel there wasn't really a hockey career, it was just sadness. But the reality was that I was pretty obnoxious because it didn't matter to me who won. And then as the series went along, I kind of went back and forth a little bit, kind of, sort of, and yet Vancouver ultimately was the team I wanted to see finally win that Stanley Cup. They didn't, famously, of course, but it did not affect my fandom of Boston or Vancouver negatively. I thought both teams behaved badly in that Stanley Cup Final, and I've done multiple videos on it. Number three on the board is the Minnesota North Stars. So Minnesota comes up on the board. And yes, I mean Minnesota, as in Minnesota and Dallas, I'm treating differently for this. The Minnesota North Stars, that 1981 run to the Stanley Cup Final, I absolutely loved that. It really drew me in to the Stanley Cup playoff experience. Now, that's when it was 1 versus 16, 2 versus 15, and all of that. And there were a lot of upsets. So for people like, I think they should go to a system like this because we won't see as many upsets. You know what? It doesn't matter. You can change the playoff format however you like. Underdogs are still going to win. If you don't like it, then just drop the number of teams to 8 that make it to the Stanley Cup playoffs. That'll never happen. Like, you're going to be able to get owners to go, oh, yeah, we want to make less money in the playoffs. Good job, genius. Number 4 on the board is also not Dallas. It's the Quebec Nordiques. The Quebec Nordiques, Battle of Quebec, of course, back in the mid-late 80s. You'll notice Boston's on the board and the Nordiques are on the board. So those were the teams that Montreal was against a lot. My dad's favorite team was Montreal. So I got a kick out of rooting for Quebec, and then I became a Bruins fan, which really led to some interesting conversations in my home. But yeah, the Quebec Nordiques, I loved the team. This is why when people get mad at me, because I say I don't think the NHL is bringing them back, it's not that I don't want them back. I do. It's just it doesn't feel like the NHL has that interest there. So maybe that changes, but at the very least, Nordiques end up number 4, which brings us to number 5, which is Dallas. So the Dallas Stars, when Minnesota moved to Dallas, my fandom moved with them. It's never been as strong for the Dallas Stars as it was for the Minnesota North Stars, because you never forget your first love, and to me, Minnesota North Stars were that first love, more so than the Dallas Stars, although I do enjoy Dallas Stars hockey. I've loved this Dallas Stars jersey for a very long time. This one I've had way predating the channel. This was one of the first jerseys I had when I started my jersey collection before it was really a collection per se. But yeah, the Dallas Stars, always been a fan, and not as much as I was the Minnesota North Stars, but still pretty big fan. Number 6 on the board is Ottawa. So of the current teams in the NHL, this is still kind of the order 1, 2, 3, and 4. And so I do have a loyalty there because I've seen the comments about, he just jumps on a bandwagon. No, not really. The Ottawa Senators certainly would not be a team that I would jump on a wet bandwagon for. But dating back to their first NHL game, Alanis Morissette singing the anthem, I was a huge, and that's before You Ought to Know. That was before You Ought to Know came out. She was singing a national anthem at the Ottawa Senators game, and I was a big fan way before You Ought to Know. So yeah, I like the teeny stuff, the teenage dance music she was doing. Nobody else did. I was like the only fan, I think, of Always Too Hot, Never Too Cold. But I still sing that anytime I hear, it's always too hot. Oh, there we go. This song's stuck in my head. And if you know it, it might be stuck in yours, and you're welcome. But yeah, Ottawa, I've always been a fan of. It feels like they get less attention than the other team in Ontario, whose name escapes me. And rooting for an underdog, it feels like Ottawa's always kind of an underdog, so easy enough to root for them. Number 7 on the board is a team that no longer exists, the Hartford Whalers. The Whale I was rooting for in the mid to late 80s as well, at times. Because again, anytime a playoff series would start, I'd kind of be like, okay, who do I want to see win this? So before the internet came along and I was informed that you can only cheer for one team, I watched hockey a little different than everybody else apparently. I'd watch the start of the game, and I'd be like, okay, I want that team to win tonight. To be honest, I still kind of watch hockey that way. I still have a team I'm preferring to win every single night. The difference from then till now is which team I want to win on any given night does change. And so there have been nights where I've been like, man, every team I was kind of rooting for won tonight. And then there are nights where I'm like, man, I was just a jinx and I didn't even say it out loud. The hockey gods knew who I wanted to win and they decided no was the answer to every single game. But the Hartford Whalers, how could you root against the Whalers? They had those beautiful jerseys, the most fantastic logo in the history of sports. And yeah, I mean, the fact that the H exists right in that space between the W and the fin, really nicely done. And I like the team. Again, underdogs, I do generally root for underdogs. You're going to notice there's no team on the board that's been a dynasty in the time that I've watched hockey. And that's not really a surprise, which brings us to number 8, which is the Florida Panthers. So what did I say about underdogs? Well, Florida has been an underdog basically their entire existence. There really hasn't been a time that they were a favorite. I mean, even they won the President's Trophy a couple years back. Were they a favorite going into the playoffs? No. So yeah, Florida's always been an underdog, and dating back to '96, I really wanted to see them finish that storyline in '96 with the Stanley Cup. Plastic rats all over the ice and everything, but in the end, it wasn't meant to be. They ran into Colorado in that final. And after that, Florida went through some pain before they got back to that Stanley Cup final this year, where they went through some pain. And so we'll see if Florida can finally win themselves a Stanley Cup in 2024. I wouldn't mind if they did. Number 9 on the board is Carolina. So Dallas is two spots below Minnesota. Carolina 2 spots below Hartford. So when Hartford moved to Carolina, did Carolina stay an underdog? Absolutely. Did they also kind of ruin the logo scheme? Yeah. The Carolina logo I've never been a big fan of. Also, their color scheme, I remember thinking red and black, because that hasn't been done. So there was a part of me that right from the beginning I was like, come on. So I've never quite been the same level of fan for Carolina as I was for Hartford, but I do still like Carolina, and if they win a Stanley Cup this year, that would be their second in their history. They won it in '06, which was a surprise to almost everybody. And I've seen people say, well, they had a good year that year. Yeah, but I remember the talk going into the playoffs. And again, coming from a Canadian perspective, nobody expected Carolina to win that Stanley Cup in '06. All the conversations were about almost every other team except Carolina. And even going into that final, there was an air of, well, Edmonton should win this, right? And then Rolison gets hurt, and everything changed after that. Number 10 on the board, Capitals. The Capitals may surprise some people, but I was a huge fan of the Capitals in the 80s, so it's kind of like, okay, I kind of have to put the Capitals up here. The Capitals have to be in that top 12 at the very least. Rooted for them in the late 80s. Underdog? Yes, absolutely. Stanley Cup, not until 2018. So, again, teams that I cheer for generally are not ones that win that often. I've even got it in the back of my mind that, now that I have the channel, everybody knows who I root for. Will Dallas, Boston, or Vancouver ever win a Stanley Cup again? And I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. I'd like to see it, but anyways, the Capitals are number 10. Number 11, the Colorado Rockies. Why? When I was a kid and I started watching hockey, to me the name Colorado Rockies for a team, just I loved it. I thought it was great. And I was a huge fan of a team that couldn't win a game. They couldn't get out of their own way, and they were pretty bad, but I was really rooting for them to turn it around. I didn't care that they were a division rival to the Vancouver Canucks. Rival might be a strong word when you're talking about the Colorado Rockies. They were not good, and then they moved to New Jersey, and they were really not good for a long time. So, yeah, the Rockies though. I'll always have a soft spot for them. That's part of the reason why when Colorado brought in that third jersey that clearly has echoes to the Rockies. And they've done other jerseys that have had some echoes to that Rockies era. I think it's great. I understand it was a short era. I know they didn't win very much, but still, I think it's nice when they pay some kind of homage to it. Number 12, Buffalo. Yep, the expansion brethren to the Vancouver Canucks, and a history which has been right around the same when it comes to misery. The Buffalo Sabres, it has been a tough go of it over the many, many years that they've been around. And hopefully that changes soon, but right now they're below the playoff line. So right now I'm definitely rooting for Buffalo. Not above the three teams I cheer for, but would they be ahead of Ottawa if I was ranking them right now? I don't know. Maybe. I haven't sat down and tried to think that through. Again, I watch so much hockey. I watch every team equally, so it's more and more difficult for me to actually say, well, this is my favorite and this is my least favorite right now. Number 13, Tampa. All right, so this is the first team that you could make an argument has had some sort of dynasty. By recent standards, it would qualify as a dynasty, I guess. They made the Stanley Cup final 3 straight years. First time that's happened in a very long time, complete with 2 Stanley Cups. But Tampa I've rooted for. And Tampa at times I've rooted for them pretty heavily. Back in 2015 especially. That was one team I really wanted to see win the Stanley Cup. There are times before that too where I've been a fan of the team. So they're not in that top 10, but at times I've found myself rooting for them. This is where it gets tricky. This is where if people skip to the end of this video, they're going to be like, wait, what? So number 14 is the current Winnipeg Jets. For current Winnipeg Jets, I have to use the current logo, don't I? All right, give me a sec. Discuss amongst yourselves. Why didn't Shannon think this through before doing the video? So, because otherwise it's going to throw people off. So the Winnipeg Jets, the current Winnipeg Jets. Now, is this related to the fact that my wife cheers for them? Maybe a little bit, but I do think that if we weren't together and if I was, off on my own, I think I'd be rooting for the Winnipeg Jets right now. I like a lot of the players on the team. I have gradually become more and more of a fan of the Winnipeg Jets every year. And coming out of that situation in Atlanta, where they were a team that never had any level of success, it's nice to see Winnipeg doing well this year. I'd like to see them do well in the playoffs as well. So they end up number 14. Number 15. It may surprise some people to see Seattle this high, but I don't have any reason to dislike Seattle, nor have I ever. And I did find myself kind of rooting for them in the playoffs last year, although when Dallas knocked them off, I was happy Dallas knocked them off. On some level, I thought, if that storyline had gone on one more round, right? If we'd had Seattle versus Las Vegas, just imagine the amount of theories that would have been out there about both of Gary's teams. What a surprise. But anyways, Seattle, I do enjoy everything related to the Seattle Kraken. I'm glad they get a team. I keep hearing about, Seattle fans are new fans. Not really. Seattle's been a hockey city before. Washington State has a large number of hockey teams in it. So Washington State fans are generally pretty well educated about the sport, more so than in some other locations when the NHL's gone there. So yeah, I found myself rooting for Seattle at times. So now we're right around the middle, and we're getting into Atlanta Thrashers territory. Now there's no Atlanta Flames on this board, because the Atlanta Flames were playing before I was a regular watcher of the NHL. I don't remember ever watching an Atlanta Flames game. But the Atlanta Thrashers, clearly I would. As soon as they came into the league, I was like, okay, they're going back to Atlanta. We'll see how it works. And I rooted for, again, underdogs, yes. Success during the regular season, not really. And so I found myself rooting for them to turn things around. And that's kind of a standard for me, which is why if people have perceived that, I'm kind of hoping Atlanta, or not Atlanta, Arizona and Buffalo turn things around, that's why. I do like to see those underdogs, rise up a little bit. I do like to see that rotation of who's at the top of the league, so there's different teams and different matchups and rivalries are born. And Atlanta never really had much rivalry because they never really went anywhere in terms of playoffs. They never won a game in the playoffs as the Atlanta Thrashers. Number 17 is New Jersey. So you'll notice the Colorado Rockies ahead of New Jersey. When they went to the New Jersey area and they called themselves the Devils, I was like, well, that's great. I can't wait to see that logo. And when this came out, I was honestly a little bit disappointed. Now, I came around quickly to that, realizing this was a great logo, but I wanted to see, like, what does a New Jersey Devil look like? And then this was the logo, and I was like, I guess that's it. Of course, there's a whole folktale with the Jersey Devil and everything, but for me, yeah, I did root for them in the late 80s, underdogs, right? Then when the whole trap era was going on, I did not root for them at all. Found myself rooting for them again as underdogs the last time they went to the Stanley Cup final. I was like, sure, let's see Brodeur get another Stanley Cup win, but the Kings said no. So, yeah, New Jersey ends up right around the middle. Right in the middle, the New York Islanders. The New York Islanders were the team I liked the least in the early 80s. Dynasty, yep. Winning everything, yep. And they were beating teams I rooted for to stay there as the number one team in the league. So Minnesota North Stars, then the Vancouver Canucks, and then they knocked off an Edmonton Oilers team I thought might be fun to see them win the Stanley Cup. So they were not a favorite team of mine. The New York Islanders, though, around the middle of the pack, because I think back to in the mid 90s when they went on that run in 93. That run in 93 was fun to watch. They took out Pittsburgh. They got all the way to the conference final. All third place teams made it to the conference final that year. It was great. But just for the unpredictability of it, I always like unpredictable playoffs. So the New York Islanders end up right in the middle. Number 19, Winnipeg Jets. So the original Winnipeg Jets, and I know that there's always the discussion of, well, it's the same name, so it's all the same, and give them all back their history. The Winnipeg Jets of the 80s, I wasn't a huge fan of, and while I do like to root for underdogs and everything, I just didn't find myself rooting for the Jets as much as I rooted for others. So, yeah, the old Winnipeg Jets I was not a fan of anywhere near what I am of the current Jets. There were players I liked in Winnipeg, like I loved Howard Dave Babich was another. Essenza was a goaltender I really liked, but yeah, those Winnipeg Jets in general, I didn't find myself rooting for them. Number 20, Columbus Blue Jackets. The Blue Jackets are not a team that's ever gotten out of the second round, and they've only got to the second round once, and this is a team that desperately needs some kind of playoff run. So if anybody wants to talk about, I don't know, attendance in Columbus, look at that attendance. Yeah, the attendance in Columbus sometimes is not great, but they haven't really been given a lot of reasons to go out to games in terms of any kind of success in the playoffs, and it's been over 2 decades. So I totally understand why fans in Columbus would maybe have sticker shock looking at ticket prices and whatnot. But yeah, Columbus is a team that, I kind of hope turns things around at some point soon, but I've never really found myself rooting for them too much, and I've never found myself hating on them either because there really isn't any reason for me to hate on them. Number 21, Toronto. So one of the most discussed, of course, is that when the channel started out, I couldn't stand Toronto. And it really comes down to oversaturation of coverage. They are covered way too much. It's crazy. I don't think that if I was a pro player, I would want to play in Toronto because the scrutiny every single shift, it's insane. The expectation set on these players is kind of odd. Players are going to have bad games. They're going to have bad weeks. That's what happens. And no matter how good a player is, they're going to have bad games and bad weeks. But in Toronto, it gets magnified and blown up and turned into this huge deal. And so I totally understand why players look at that and say, I think I'll go play in California, where they can be relatively anonymous. The weather's nice year round, so for their family can be anonymous as well, in really nice home. And again, it's warm all year round. You have less to worry about, right? So I get it. Number 22, starting the next row, the Arizona Coyotes. So, the original Jets are here. The Coyotes are here. So, yes, it takes a bit of a hit when they move to Arizona. I was not a fan of the Arizona look, that Kachina that everybody loves now. The Arizona Coyotes are there. I have found myself rooting for them a bit lately because they're the franchise everybody likes to kick right now because they've been down in the standings, obviously, with their arena situation, with all of the discussions of where somebody's going to relocate and what's going to happen. It's just, I kind of feel bad for the fans of the Coyotes. Yeah, the whole, and then of course there'll always be the comments of, oh, all three of them, which is just inaccurate. It's an inaccurate total, but I get it on some level, and so I'm kind of right now. If I was grading these teams, I would probably have Arizona as one of the higher teams because of the fact that I kind of feel bad for the fan base, for the team, and I respect that they've played well enough. While there's all those distractions that they would be completely forgiven for if those distractions cause them to be, well, distracted. Number 23, Minnesota. So what's interesting is the Minnesota North Stars are number 3. The Minnesota Wild are 23. I have never been a huge fan of the Minnesota Wild. So while people can argue, well, he cheers for the Jets because it's his wife's team, I do like when the Wild do well because I'm glad to see Yvonne happy when the Wild do well. But in general, when I'm for this video going over their entire history and my fandom and everything, I have never been a huge fan of the Minnesota Wild, which again is weird because when the Minnesota Wild were announced, I went out immediately. I got a Minnesota Wild pennant. I got a Minnesota Wild hat. I got, Minnesota Wild stuff because, again, I was collecting hockey stuff at the time. And I was so excited. I was like, this is going to be great. There's a team back in Minnesota. I'm going to cheer for them. And just right out of the gate, I was like, it's not the same. So same location, but I've never connected with the Minnesota Wild the way I did the Minnesota North Stars. It's bizarre. Number 24, Nashville. I've gone back and forth on Nashville. Obviously, back in 2017 when they went to the final, I was firmly on that bandwagon for them to win a Stanley Cup. They didn't, but it was a fun ride while it lasted. It was great, and so the Nashville Predators end up 24th on the board today, just because overall, early in their existence, they were sort of an underdog. Usually one that won more games than expected, but yeah, still Nashville ends up 24th. Number 25. St. Louis. So the St. Louis Blues, there have been times where St. Louis would have been at the bottom. I'm looking back at the 80s for that. I don't know what it was. I don't know what it was to me as a kid. I wasn't a St. Louis fan. I just didn't like St. Louis. And I'm old enough to remember when there was the threat of them moving to Saskatoon and the NHL stepped in and said pardon and put an end to that. But which I've already done a video on, but I've reached the point where a lot of those historical videos are old enough now. I should probably do updated looks at them. So the look at the time they almost moved to Saskatoon warrants another look probably. But yeah, St. Louis overall, I've just never been a huge fan. And I remember in the early 90s when they were going out and spending all that money and then the team would fall apart in the playoffs. And I'd love to say that I didn't kind of snicker about it, but at times it was the team I was rooting for that knocked them out. I took a little bit of joy in that. Number 26 might surprise people. Vegas. I love going to Las Vegas. I do. I love going to the city of Las Vegas. I love Vegas Golden Knight fans that I've met too. I really, really love going to Vegas. Do I cheer for the team? Not really. No. Which is weird, right? Like we went to a couple of Vegas Golden Knights games, 4 years ago now, I think. Yeah, I think it was 4 years ago. It could be 5 actually. I think it was 5. Anyways, it's been a while since we went to a Vegas Golden Knights game because we normally go during the summer, right? But Vegas, while we love going there, I love visiting. I intend to visit again next summer. It's a great place to go for cheap flights and everything, and I always talk about that. The team itself, I'm not a big Vegas fan. So when I see, comments, Vegas is really high in the power rankings, and well, it's just because he's a Vegas fan because that's where he goes on holiday. That has nothing to do with it. Nothing. You'll notice Anaheim and LA, I've gone there too. They're not on the board yet either. So, yeah, Vegas, 26th out of 38 on the board. Colorado. So you'll notice the Nordiques 4, Colorado 27. I was mad when they moved to Denver, and then I was angrier when they got Patrick Roy and won the Stanley Cup. I was like, that's a cheat code right there. That's not even fair. Montreal got hosed in that trade. They shouldn't have traded Patrick Roy, so I was not happy. And they won it again in 2001. I wasn't a big happy fan with that either. At the time, I was a huge supporter of the idea of Dallas winning more than one Stanley Cup. Dallas won it in '99. They get to the final in 2000, and it just, yeah, they never got back again. So I wasn't a big fan of the Avs. Although I could be fans of individual players like Sakic, absolutely. Forsberg, who wasn't a fan of Forsberg, but the team, that jersey they're wearing on that ice, I was never a big fan. Number 28, and I've gone back and forth on this one. This one was tough for me to figure out. So, in recent years, San Jose would be right at the bottom. However, San Jose, when they started out and they were underdogs, I rooted for them. I remember when they knocked off Detroit in the first round that one year. I was so ecstatic with that result. That was just, I couldn't believe that. I was like, we get another year of saying Detroit dead things, which is what we did locally. Because I've had Red Wing fans saying, oh, no, they stopped saying that in the early 80s. Not around here, we didn't. And yeah, San Jose was part of what kept that going. And they were a good, fun group. And then they started owning the Canucks, which is when the fandom dropped off. Like every time Vancouver played them, San Jose just whooped them. And I was angry about it. So there's a lot of salt at the bottom of this board because that's kind of how it works. The teams you don't like are usually the rival to the team that you do, or it's a team that's beaten the team you don't like. And especially if you don't like how that team beat the team that you like, this is all going to have an impact on your fandom going forward. Number 29, Edmonton. So the Oilers back in the early 80s, I was a fan. Loved the speed, the skill, Gretzky, Messier, Curry. I was a huge Mark Messier fan in the mid 80s. And then it started to change in the late 80s. As I got older, that fandom fell off, and it never really came back. So again, today, right now, with hockey being as all around me all the time as it is, I don't hate on the Oilers, but back in the day, did I? Yeah. I've often talked about the '06 Stanley Cup final. Carolina's against Edmonton, and before the game, I'm like, okay, gotta root for Edmonton. Stanley Cup in Canada, gotta root for Edmonton. Then Carolina scored a goal, and I cheered, and I went, damn, I was sure I had talked myself into cheering for Edmonton, and I cheered for Carolina during that Stanley Cup final, and I feel terrible about it. Number 30, Philadelphia. Philadelphia, I've really kind of been, I don't know, on the fence with most of, like, I can't say I've hated Philadelphia, but I can't say I've ever been a big fan of the Flyers either. And I don't know what it is, but I know as a kid, I used to mix them up with the Blackhawks. Don't even ask. I don't even know why I mixed up Chicago and Philly all the time, but I did. And I just had, I mean, it's like in football, I used to mix up Tennessee and Jacksonville all the time. No idea why there either. So, yeah, Philadelphia Flyers end up towards the bottom of the board. I will say Gritty, though. That was a pretty smart move in terms of adding themselves a mascot. But yeah, I was never a big Eric Lindros fan either. Remember, I was a Nordiques fan, so not a big Lindros fan. At the time, we didn't know the whole story about why Lindros didn't want to go to Quebec. Now that we know, at least for me, I look at that and I go, you know what? That's fair. I am totally fair. That's totally a fair reason not to want to go. But at the time, I wasn't happy. I wasn't a big Bobby Clark fan either, and yeah, there are a lot of things there. Number 31, Anaheim. So Anaheim was at the absolute bottom not too long ago. They're not at the bottom now. Those evil Anaheim people trying to turn me into an Anaheim fan, and gosh darn it, they've done something, because I'm not happy with how the Ducks are playing right now. Not happy at all. I think I understand that not much was expected of them this season, but they got off to that really good start. And now they're kind of off the rails, and it's like, come on. They're better than what they've been over the last 6 games. They're way better than they were last night against Edmonton. At least I think so. But anyways, yeah, the Ducks, 31st on the board. Number 32, Chicago. So again, I went kind of back and forth on where to put Chicago. But while I was a fan in the late 80s, early 90s, because outside of Vancouver, Boston, Dallas, and mostly Ottawa as well, my fandom can switch from one year to the next. A trade can make a difference. A good or bad run by a team can make a difference as to who I might be rooting for in any given game. That's why I don't get into it. And after the playoffs, I usually do a video for members and patrons saying, here's who I was actually cheering for in the playoffs. Because people get it wrong quite often. But yeah, Chicago, again, right now, there's a lot of people who don't like the Blackhawks. Totally get that. And for me, it's been a long time. And again, Chicago and Philly, when I was a kid, I never cheered for either of them. And if I did, with Chicago, that would have been the early 90s, the Belfour, Roenick, Chelios era, although I was never a big Chelios fan either. But that didn't last that long either. It was for a few years that I was a fan of the Blackhawks, and then it changed. Number 33. Won't surprise anybody to see the Rangers in the bottom row. Again, if I was going by right now, the Rangers would be higher. If I was going by 1994, I don't even know if I'd want to put their logo on the board. I was so mad. I was mad at the Rangers for a few years after that. It's gone now, because every now and then I'll see 94 was a long time ago. Let it go. What if I held a grudge with every team that's knocked Vancouver, Boston, or Dallas out of the playoffs? I would have a ridiculous list of awfulness. So yeah, the New York Rangers 33rd overall. Again, if I was doing this right now, they would not be 33rd out of 32 teams. But yeah, New York Rangers 33. 34 won't probably surprise people. What did I say? Teams that play against teams I cheer for in the playoffs, that'd be Calgary. Teams that beat teams I cheer for in the playoffs, that would also be Calgary. So while the Vancouver Canucks went to the Stanley Cup final after beating Calgary in 82, in 94, did they play them in 20? They didn't play them in 2011. But yeah, there's two times where they've gone to the final after beating them. But Calgary's also owned Vancouver in the playoffs. I have no doubt in my mind that if Calgary and Vancouver meet in the playoffs in the next few years, Calgary will probably beat them again. And I'll probably be reminded deep down, like, this is why I don't like Calgary. But 89 was really where that peaked for me, where my dislike of Calgary hit an all-time high. I've mentioned before, Joel Otto, puck went in off his skate into the net. And a friend of mine that lived in Edmonton, in order to make me feel better, he mailed me, and I'm talking snail mail, in an envelope, about 20 Joel Otto cards. So, and a little letter in there saying, ha ha ha, here's some hockey cards to make you feel better. So he was a good friend. A good friend would do that. Get a bunch of Joel Otto cards from a hockey card shop and send them to you. But yeah, so Calgary. Number 35, Detroit. Now, right now, Detroit, I love their broadcast team. Mickey Redmond's fantastic. Ken Daniels is a really good play-by-play guy. But if we're talking about the entire time that I've watched hockey, Detroit has to be near the bottom of the board. I was not a fan of the Detroit Red Wings of the mid to late 90s, early 2000s at all. Really, really not a fan. The 2002 playoffs, I was so mad that Vancouver got that lead in that series and then lost against Detroit. I so badly wanted to see Vancouver take out Detroit because we knew how good that team was, and then Detroit came back and won. And I remember having some conversations with people about some of the tactics of Red Wing players, but again, when your team loses, you will find reasons to hate the other team. Number 36 on the board, not last either, the Montreal Canadiens. So it's been an interesting relationship I've had with the Montreal Canadiens because coming in as a kid, of course, my dad's favorite team was Montreal. So I, as a kid, was like, hey, my dad's team's Montreal. I'm going to cheer for Montreal. Then I got a little bit older and I realized, this dad guy. So I started rooting for other teams. I started rooting for Hartford when they were against Montreal. I rooted for Quebec. I rooted for Boston. I even sang the whole Star Spangled Banner before the game when they were doing the anthems. And I remember my dad just was beside himself. Like, why do you know that? Because it's before every game. Of course I know all the lyrics. And my mom joined in and sang along as well. And he kept saying, I don't know who you people are. So I've known the Star Spangled Banner for a very long time. This is why when anthem singers go up and don't know Oh Canada when they're in the States, I'm like, seriously? I've known your anthem since I was a little kid. But yeah, Montreal towards the bottom. And I've talked about this before as a Boston fan. I like it when Montreal's good. I like it when Montreal's a good team when they're in the playoffs because I love to see Boston beat Montreal when they're good. I am well aware that Montreal has beaten Boston a lot because I've watched it and it's broken my heart every time. But I would trade those memories for nothing. That was just Honestly, some of the best hockey I've ever watched has been between Boston and Montreal. They met each other every year in the playoffs for I think it was 7 years straight. I never complained that they met. Every year was like, okay, here we go. Because every year it was my dad, it was me. He's cheering for Montreal, I'm cheering for Boston. Let's go. And, part of me kind of misses that. All right, second to last is Pittsburgh. So, Pittsburgh, again, when I came into watching hockey, Penguin. What kid doesn't like Penguins? So, of course, I'd like Penguins. And I'm talking about like Peter Lee, Ron Flockhart, Randy Carlyle, Michel Dion in the net, and Denny Herron. I'm that old, but yeah, and then Mario came in, and for whatever reason, I was never a Mario fan. It was almost like you had to pick between Wayne or Mario, and I was like, well, I like Wayne, so there you go. Now looking back at their careers, I have nothing but respect for Mario Lemieux. I think Mario Lemieux has multiple times over saved that franchise in Pittsburgh. Without Mario Lemieux, I don't know if they'd be the Pittsburgh Penguins. They might have ended up in Portland or Hamilton or somewhere else. But yeah, the Pittsburgh Penguins overall, again, looking at the average watching hockey, they had to be near the bottom. Dating back to 91, 92, knocking out Boston, angry as I got. Then they knocked off Minnesota in the 91 Stanley Cup final. That definitely has an impact as well. So the last team on the board is LA. And when I look at it over the history of my time watching hockey, the LA Kings have consistently had some of the nicest jerseys I've ever seen and teams I can't stand more than almost any other. That is not the case now. That is absolutely not the case now. A lot of players I like with the LA Kings. I think this team has built itself back up to being a contender. And, we'll see what they do come playoff time. But when I look at my time watching hockey from 1981 until now, there had to be a team at the bottom. And to me, it just worked that it was the Kings. That consistently over the years, the Kings were a team I would have had at or near the bottom. 93, I was so mad at them for knocking off Toronto. I didn't get Toronto, Montreal in the Stanley Cup final. That's what I think almost everybody in Canada wanted. Not necessarily, notice I'm saying almost. There were definitely some that didn't. But yeah, the Kings in general over the years have been the team that if I'm going to say I don't like Team A is usually going to be LA. But anyways, there you go. These are not accurate as to where teams are at right now. Although, yes, Vancouver, Boston, Dallas, because they've been my favorites. But notice, Dallas is fifth on the board. So let me know your thoughts in the comment section below, as always. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe, as a lot of people apparently have done. And thank you guys so much for that. Thank you for all your support, as always. And here's to seeing how much bigger the channel can get. I don't know what the answer is to that, but I look forward to finding out. Thank you guys so much for all your support. I'll talk to you again soon.